Thanks, Jan. So I'm going to cover a few of the technologies behind clean energy and mobility. Before I get into that, just a little bit of context in terms of what we now, on our current numbers, see is happening in the electricity industry right through to 2050. By 2050, we believe that in the world as a whole, roughly 50% of generation, and that's generation, not capacity, will be wind and solar. If you add in other renewables such as hydro, it's more like 64%. So just under 2/3 will be renewable of one sort or another. And the remainder built up of nuclear and fossil fuels, but declining quite rapidly from today's levels. So even though we have a lot of renewables today, that's a major shift. We will need, however, much more flexibility and balancing in the system. So it's going to have to be a very different type of energy system and electricity system in the future. Just in terms of some of the characteristics of that capacity that's going in, and not just capacity, but things like storage, it's very different. It's not just that it's renewable, it's the nature of that capacity. So it's much more modular. We're talking about small building blocks. We're talking about things that sit at the edge of the network, such as PV, but also storage assets, demand response. They're all, in a sense, distributed assets, and they need to be consolidated and managed. It's very decentralized, not just in terms of the capacity, but also in terms of that flexibility. And we're talking about openness. We're talking about digitally controllable assets that can be controlled by many of the same technologies we've seen in the internet and elsewhere. So it's much more open in that sense. Very importantly, it's not deterministic. This system is becoming so much more complex and will become even more complex that you can't think about controlling it by a deterministic algorithm. You just couldn't write something with that level of complexity. So that's why we see technologies such as AI, other forms of software, advanced algorithms, very critical to managing the system. And we actually heard a lot about that yesterday. And finally, but not least, the ability for new entrants to compete at the service layer. We've seen that in, for example, Sonnen competing in services, starting with a battery, but offering energy services on top of that. I could have put up exactly the same sort of chart for what happened with the internet, and it would have many similar features on it. So think about this as a network that's evolving, not just in terms of capacity and generation. Actually, could I just get a glass of water? So in terms of what that distributed energy network looks like, it's more like this. It's less something that's centrally controlled, but more something that moves into clusters of different assets. So you could have, for example, a heat pump at the edge of the network, edge processing, Internet of Things technologies, obviously storage, obviously PV and other forms of generation. So the assets and the technologies are becoming much more diffuse, much more dispersed. And you can think about them connecting in to one another in clusters. It's no longer a system that needs to be centrally managed right at the center with a control system. It can be a combination of that, but also quite a lot of decentralized management as well. So this is why I say it's a much more internet-like network. It's not the internet, but it has some of the same characteristics. You don't go back to a central control system for the internet, nor will you need to for the energy system of the future. And a good example of that is microgrids. Microgrids are typically, you will have some generation, you'll have some storage, you'll almost certainly, if it's in the developing world, you'll have a diesel backup for your microgrid. So that's on the supply side, and you have a microgrid controller that sits at the edge of the network that optimizes all of those assets on the supply side. But equally, that microgrid controller can typically do demand response. It can do some demand management. So you can think of this as something sitting at the edge, the brains are in the microgrid controller, and it's managing supply and demand. And essentially, it's a sort of self-governing system, and you only then need to go back to the central grid when you absolutely need to. So ideally, you'd like this thing to be, completely self-operating and autonomous. In practice, it's a little bit of a mixture of the two. We see these growing, by the way, rapidly in China, in industrial parks, and we see a lot of emerging interest in other parts of the world, ranging from hospitals, schools, to military bases, in the United States. So that's one example of one of these decentralized sets of technologies. Now, I mentioned before that the system's becoming much more complex to control. So machine learning is actually one of the very useful tools to do that. So what things are machine learning, is machine learning good at? Well, there are three I'd highlight. I'm sure there are more than this. But one is categorizing data. So the ability to look at data from labeled data and identify, for example, it could be cracks in a wind turbine, or if you're talking about driving, it could be a road hazard ahead. So recognizing known patterns. But equally, you can also use machine learning to look for patterns in unstructured data. So for example, if you're looking for a cyber security attack that might be occurring for the very first time on your network, machine learning techniques can be used to detect those kind of anomalies without actually knowing what the pattern is in advance. And very importantly, managing complex systems, whether they're virtual power plants, energy management systems, or autonomous vehicles. So it's a powerful technology. And you might think, well, how long's machine learning been around? 3 years, 5 years, maybe a bit longer? Actually, this has a very long history, as do many technologies. A lot of technologies have been with us for many years, and it's only when they come to light we start reading and talking about them. So you can take this back to at least the 1950s. This was produced by Professor Minsky, and it's the first neuron in the snark. I'm not quite sure what snark stands for, but this was a very crude device. It had capacitors, motors, valves. I mean, you can see it's very old technology, but it was the first neuron in a neural network, a very simple version of that could form its own connections. Clearly, things have moved on a lot since then. This is a well-publicized example from Google of how they've been able to reduce energy consumption, unuseful energy consumption in their data centers. So in a data center, you've got lots of things you can control and measure. You've got temperature, pressure. You can power up a cooling tower if you want, or power it down. So you can think about it as a very complex control system. And they've used machine learning techniques and deep learning networks to optimize that and also work out what the optimal configuration of the parameters might be, getting roughly, and that's the chart on the right, the green line trending downwards. The latest result is about 30% saving in energy consumption. That's unuseful energy consumption. In a data center, you want as much energy to be going into the computing as you can, not wasted, as it were, in things like cooling, although some of that's necessary. So machine learning solves a lot of problems. What I personally believe is it's not actually thinking. So if you think, we're all threatened by this and it's in any way close to replicating real human intelligence, I think we are a long way from that. And, a bit philosophical, but maybe we'll never get there. So changing tack a little bit onto autonomous vehicles, the buzzword in, well, not just autonomous actually, but vehicles in general, the buzzword here is CASE, connected, autonomous, shared, and electric. I'm not going to talk so much about shared because that would take too long, and you're probably very familiar with a lot of the applications there, but I'm going to talk about the other three and some of the technologies behind them. So in terms of the global, taking electrification, the global outlook at the moment is we're up to 5 million passenger EVs globally. That's roughly doubling every 18 months or so. So go back 18 months, it was about half that. So it's pretty aggressive growth. You can see the shape of the curve. This is the early days of something that's growing pretty much exponentially. A lot of that's in China, interestingly. And I think there will be a lift-off point where the cost of an electric vehicle comes down to a level where it's comparable with an internal combustion engine vehicle. And you may get, at the same sort of time, consumer adoption effects where people copy one another. They see someone else has got an electric vehicle, and they suddenly want one. So watch out for this lift-off. It hasn't really happened yet, but these are the early signs. What's important behind that is, in terms of technology, lithium-ion battery costs, which have been the highest component of cost in an electric vehicle. So you can see how much this has come down. 8 years ago, it would have been well over $1,000 per kilowatt hour for a lithium-ion battery suitable for an electric vehicle. Now we're down, by the end of last year, to $176 per kilowatt hour. And we expect that to trend down to probably about 60 or just about above that by the end of 2030. This is driven by a lot of incremental innovation. Economies of scale are important, but chemistries and improvements in battery density are helping as well. Investment is still going into the transport sector in a big way. You can see from the chart a lot in 2018, a lot of that went into autonomous vehicle technologies, and quite a lot actually into chips to support that, as well as connected cars. So those three themes I mentioned are certainly attracting investors' attention. And in terms of progress, I think I put this chart up last year actually for autonomous vehicles. The number of passenger miles of autonomous vehicle experience is up to 3.5 million globally. I think it was about 1.5 last time I showed this chart. So that's been ramping up. And the disengagement rate, which is essentially where a driver has to intervene because the autonomous vehicle hasn't done what you expected it to do, so a human's had to take over, that rate's been coming down as the network, as the learning, and as the data has improved. So this is a moving thing. Tesla actually, incidentally, claim they have a lot more data than just this 3.5 million miles in terms of their conventional fleet, their non-autonomous fleet. So it's probably even higher than this in terms of the overall experience. It's not just about neural networks and data, it's where you get the data from. So we've seen a lot of innovation and investor interest actually in perception. How do you get the perception? And views differ on this. Tesla does not believe in LiDAR, they're quite public about that. Others do. Our view actually is it's probably going to be a combination of different sensors that you will need to get the data that you need for autonomous driving. Because they're good at different things. So some are good at lane detection, others are good at long-distance vision. Vision itself will almost certainly be an important component of this using cameras, but it may not be just cameras, it may be a variety of things. And the search is on for some kind of fusion of that. It may be separate sensors, but probably some fusion of sensors, and almost certainly much more solid state in the mix, because spinning LiDAR on top of the vehicle probably isn't the long-term solution. So I think there's going to be a lot of innovation here, and also there'll be opportunities to build other services on top of these devices that are taking in data of various different forms. Finally, I wanted to say a few things about connection and connectivity. So again, there's a lot of innovation, a lot of talk about 5G. There's one standard I'm just going to run through, CV2X, which works very much in parallel with 5G. Qualcomm are very much behind this. So in terms of communications in a vehicle, you typically want the mobile network to be involved, so you'll have vehicle-to-network communications. And that's good for applications that don't require very low latency. So if it's a latency-tolerant application, going back to a mobile tower, we may have a much more dense mobile infrastructure, but going back to a mobile tower makes perfect sense. So if you're trying to find a parking space or detect a hazard that's 1 kilometer ahead, this is perfectly good. What it's not so good at is things that require very low latency. So for example, if a car's gone around a corner, it's seen an obstacle just in front of it, had to stop suddenly, and you're the other side of that corner, you'd like to know about that. You'd like that vehicle to be able to relay that information to you. And you can do that with direct connections, which is the other part of this standard. So this is vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, and also potentially vehicle to person. If you had, for example, a person who was vulnerable in some way, they might be able to carry a device that will warn a vehicle of that vulnerability in advance. So direct communications are going to be, I think, a very powerful thing in the mix. And these technologies, just as happened in other areas, people will take advantage of them in other ways. So think about it in those terms. It's not just about what you need for a safe autonomous vehicle. It's also what you can build on the communications technologies, in this case, that are being developed. So just to summarize, in terms of the overall network and energy system, it's very much becoming more internet-like. It's not the internet, but think about it in terms of a distributed network. We're no longer in the generation, transmission, distribution business in the same way as the old world. It's going to be much more diffuse and much more complex, and also much more opportunity, I think, to aggregate assets and put them together. And in terms of passenger vehicles, case connected, autonomous, shared, and electrification are the things to watch. Thank you very much.